Hello, today we're going to have a short class as we have had in 20 minutes, it might be a little less, and it's going to be on marriage. Basically, we're going to look at the things that we should know if we are thinking of being married or married again under certain circumstances, to see how we do it in order to prepare. It's not about annulments. I'm not going to go into the details of all of that. That's a separate class. But to look at getting married in the Catholic Church. The first thing, if we're going to get married in marriage, is that we have to be baptized. The second thing that we should also know is that we should be confirmed. Canon law says you don't have to be confirmed, but you should be. In the Archdiocese of New York, they require that you are confirmed for preparing for marriage. The other thing is that we have to start thinking about, have we been married before? The two spouses, one or the other or both, may have been married earlier. Maybe they've been married 2 or 3 times earlier. And that has to be looked at in order that this marriage today is going to be in a Catholic church, done properly. Sometimes we saw this recent thing that the Prime Minister of England got married in a Catholic church. He's been married a couple of times before. He married a Catholic in a Catholic ceremony. People were surprised. You've seen it in the media. The Catholic Church in England has said that it was all done properly, that they could be married in a Catholic church. I'm not going to go into the details, but you'll figure out what possibilities might happen as we go through this class. So you are married before, and you want to get married, whether you're a man or a woman, and you begin to think, was that previous marriage a valid marriage? If it was a valid marriage, I can't go now and get married in the Catholic Church. I can go back and look at that marriage and see if it was valid or not. If you were in a Catholic wedding previously and you are Catholic, then you're married. That marriage is valid. The only way you can get married again now is that previous marriage has to be judged to see if it was valid. And that's what an annulment process is all about. Sometimes people get very excited about the number of annulments. I think the reason why so many are given out is that most people don't understand marriage anymore. So it's a little bit easier for the church to declare that that previous marriage really wasn't valid. Little example, you have a couple that are very happy, and then both of them decide that they don't want to have children. If they make that decision, both of them, even though it's both of them agreeing, they can't get married. Because it's essential that marriage is to have children. It doesn't mean you have to have children, but you have to be open to children. And even if both agree, it means you can't enter matrimony. Little detail to keep in mind. Those are the kinds of things that people have to remember. You have to show the church to show why that marriage was not valid. I put some of these things here because this comes down to some basic ideas for marriage. It has to be not being under constraint. There's freedom for consent, because this is a big part of the marriage. It's a contract. Both sides have to consent freely, and not being impeded by any natural or ecclesiastical law. What's a natural law? Well, your brother and a sister, you can't get married. That's natural law. Ecclesiastical law, it may be that you are baptized and the other person is not baptized. In order to get married in a Catholic church, you have to get dispensation from the bishop for them to get married. If you don't, that marriage is not valid. Now, how could that happen? Well, it could happen that at some point you didn't know you needed to do that and you got married in a Catholic church, but afterwards you see that that was the case, then you can't get married in the Catholic Church. The marriage will be declared annulled. Anyway, to determine if the marriage is valid, you have to go before a tribunal, which is a court in the Catholic Church. The bishop is the one that makes these decisions. He can't make all of the decisions in all of the cases all of the time, but he sets up a tribunal, and the head of that tribunal is his vicar. He's the one that decides and lets the bishop know that these are the people that came before the tribunal and this is what we determined. Obviously, to go before a tribunal, sometimes it's going to require a fair amount of paperwork and study and examination and looking over the marriage. But we won't go into that just now. It's the tribunal that has to decide of whether it was a valid marriage or not. An example then, if a Protestant marries a Protestant, that marriage is considered valid by the Catholic Church. But these two Protestants break up, and then one of the Protestants wants to get married to a Catholic in the Catholic Church. They have to go back and look at that Protestant wedding and see why it was not valid, if it was not valid, because the Church considers that a valid marriage. I know it seems hard to believe that the tribunal is going to have to judge a Protestant wedding to see if it can be annulled. Sometimes we'll have a situation where the other person, or the two persons both get married in a civil ceremony. And because they're both non-Catholics getting married in a civil ceremony, it's considered a valid marriage. So it has to go back and look at that marriage as well. What always is easy is that if one Catholic marries anybody else and it's not done in a Catholic church, that's not considered a Catholic marriage. And they say, wow, it's amazing. You say, well, that's the way it is. Every Catholic can only be validly married in the Catholic Church if they do it in a Catholic church. Or under certain circumstances, with the permission of the bishop, they can do it in a synagogue or they can do it in a Protestant church, but it's with the permission of the bishop and it requires certain requirements to be fulfilled. But if you're marrying someone who is Catholic and had been married before but was not married in a Catholic church, that wedding didn't actually happen. What does that mean? Well, it means basically a tribunal or somebody designated by the tribunal will say, well, let's make sure they really were married before and that they got a civil divorce. And let's make sure that the Catholic didn't at some time or another go to the Catholic Church and have that church, have that marriage become a Catholic marriage, which is pretty easy to do. It's some paperwork. But these are the things that hold things up. Then you kind of come into the situation where you have to examine the marriage in detail to look at some of these things we looked at earlier about constraint. There's a point in canon law that everybody looks at because it has to do with this notion of constraint. It's 1095 in the canon law code. We won't go into that, but that whole thing has to be examined of, well, was there or not constraint? One of the examples of constraint that's not uncommon is the woman is pregnant and they decide to get married because she's pregnant. That's constraint. She's not free to make her decision because she's pregnant and thinks that for the best thing I have to get married. Not necessarily the case. In fact, if the marriage doesn't last, the fact that she was pregnant when she got married will probably make the marriage invalid. It means she wasn't fully free to consent at the wedding. One of the things, I lived in Houston for 25 years, one of the things that they would do in Houston is when you had that kind of case, the person should have the baby and then spend a year with her boyfriend, and after that year they make a decision whether to get married or not. It's good because it gives them time to determine that they really want to get married for the right reasons freely, even though they did have the baby. But now time has gone by, the baby's there, they can make a decision. But if they get married before the baby's born, probably it's going to be later on an invalid marriage. Things like that. Sometimes you'll have a situation where the boyfriend perhaps is caught up in drug addiction, or maybe he's an alcoholic. And they get into the marriage, they go through the ceremony, and then you realize he's not free to make consent because probably he was an alcoholic or he was on drugs at the time of the wedding ceremony, or he could have been. And it means that he wasn't fully free to make the decision because he wasn't free, period. So then that means, well, we have a reason here to say this marriage may not have been valid because this guy didn't have the ability to make a decision freely. These are oddball instances, but they happen quite often, at least in over periods of time. So when you go before the tribunal, you go through an examination process, which is sometimes it's a long process to go through the examination, and sometimes it hurts the person to go back over their previous marriage, where maybe they were together for a period of time, and maybe they had children, and then they realize it was not a valid marriage. It's heartrending, to tell you the truth. But it is good because it helps you to prepare and understand what marriage is all about. Anyway, I think a lot of annulments you have to go through those steps. But that's still to come back with the idea that the tribunal determines if the marriage is valid or not. And that means, if it's valid or not, is what happens before the marriage, not what happens after the marriage. Because what happens after is different than what happens before. What happens before affects the marriage bond. It affects the relationship between the two at the time of the wedding. What happens after is just part of struggling for life, struggling to exist, struggling to do things well. Again, for example, a lot of people will come into marriage and say, I am faithful to my husband or faithful to my wife forever, except if they are unfaithful to me with another person. You say, well, no, you can't do that because the contract is you're going to be faithful regardless. And you can't put in the exception that if my wife or my husband commits adultery, then I can walk away from the marriage. You can't do that. It destroys the contract. Before you even got into it, destroys the contract. Because, it's for better or for worse, and happiness and health and so on down the line, that we're going to stick together. And if somebody makes that mistake, we're going to have to figure out how to restore the marriage. We can't say it's invalid because it happens after the marriage where somebody gives in. And I think, again, we have to understand some of these ideas to realize what we're talking about in marriage, particularly what we're talking about in a Catholic marriage. Reading this point from the Catechism, it says the Church holds the exchange of consent between the spouses to be the indispensable element that makes the marriage. If consent is lacking, there is no marriage. And there are various ways it could be lacking, and that's somewhat what the tribunal looks at. The next point in the Catechism, 1627, the consent consists in a human act by which the partners mutually give themselves to each other. I take you to be my wife. I take you to be my husband. This consent that binds the spouses to each other finds its fulfillment in the two becoming one flesh. Once they're one flesh, there's nothing that can part them. But if there is no consent, they don't really become one flesh. They live together, they may have sexual relations together, they act like they're married, but they aren't. I realize that some people think it's a Catholic way of divorce, but it's not, because divorce is what happens after the marriage that you determine that the marriage should be broken up. The Church is looking at what's valid, what happens before the marriage to determine if it's legitimate or not. Sometimes we look at it and a person that you're marrying has been married 2 or 3 times before, or both of you may have been married 2 or 3 times before. Obviously, it means that we have to inspect those other previous marriages on both sides to see if any of them were valid before the Catholic wedding can take place. And, it might take a little bit of effort to determine that. Sometimes you may find that the first marriage was not valid The second marriage maybe was valid. So you have to kind of go through each side to make sure that both people in the end are free to get married in a Catholic church. Sometimes this happens where the two people are not baptized and they're married once each side, and then one of them becomes baptized, and then they want to get married to a Catholic now as a Catholic. And the marriage that they had previously falls apart. Well, there is a rule as a Catholic that they can get married to a Catholic under those circumstances. It's a rare thing, but it happens from time to time. Again, these are the things that the priest or an advocate for the diocese speaking with the couple getting married they have to determine how it's done. You can see the Catholic Church presumes a marriage is valid until proven otherwise. You can't just say it's probably invalid, so therefore we go forward. Well, no. The Catholic Church has to decide if it's valid or not. You may already determine that personally, but it has to be witnessed by the Catholic Church that it is invalid before in the Catholic Church you can get married again. You can't make up your own mind that it's invalid. It's something that has to be decided by the Catholic Church. Obviously, if a previous spouse is dead, then obviously there's no problem. Because sometimes you say, yeah, we were divorced, we lived together and so on, but later he died. Then that means you're free to get married again. Now maybe there's 2 or 3 spouses in various marriages. Well, maybe they all died. Or maybe one of them is still alive, but maybe that was not a valid marriage. Well, let's look at that. One of the things to know is that when we are in a marriage and we have children, those children are legitimate children. So when an annulment comes to say, well, that marriage was not valid, that doesn't mean then those children become illegitimate. No. The Catholic Church presumes that that marriage was considered a marriage and that those children are and always will be legitimate children. Some people have said to me, well, I hate to go through that process and then all my children become illegitimate. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not the way that the Catholic Church proceeds. Let's see. I'm trying to think, how much time have we gone?
Oh, about 17 minutes. So, about 3 more minutes.
Okay. I think I've covered a lot of main things here that you can reflect upon, but I guess you have to see that to get married in the Catholic Church, you really need to talk to persons who understand it. That we can't just make up our own minds to get married in the Catholic Church because we like the church, we like the parish, we like being in the Catholic Church. Maybe we've messed up our lives previously, but now we want to settle down and get married in the Catholic Church. Fine, let's do that. Let's work on that. Let's aim for that. But at the same time, we have to follow the steps that the Catholic Church asks us to follow. Sometimes we have certain situations too where the person that we enter into our contract with has held back something that's crucial to the marriage. Probably the classic thing might be that you're going to get married, you get married, but then you discover that your wife had her tubes tied or the husband had a vasectomy. Now, if you had that before marriage and then you get married and you didn't know that was taking place, you realize then the contract was not open because we couldn't have children. Now, if in a certain case the woman or the man says, this is what's happened to me, I regret it, I'm sorry, and then we can work things out that the persons can go forward. But it does open the door that I married a person under a certain kind of misunderstanding, that they weren't being honest about who they really were, or at least in terms of their ability to enter into matrimony. Sometimes it's also that the person may have other ways that they lie to the other person in the marriage that affect directly on consent or on understanding what marriage is all about. And then you don't discover that until after the marriage. So you marry a person thinking they understand marriage, but they don't understand the idea of fidelity or that the marriage is going to last forever, that there's no way you can step out of it. And you realize it because when the tribunal examines it, they look for witnesses. And witnesses can say, oh yeah, I know he always said he never wanted to have children. He always said that. Maybe the woman didn't realize that, but we have witnesses that can say that that's what the person said, the man, a number of times. And so it opens up the gate that maybe the marriage was not valid. The other thing too is interesting is it's a marriage between a man and a woman. That's the only marriage, a man and a woman. It can't be two men, can't be two women. The whole question of transgenderism is very important because if it's a man who marries a man who's transgendered into a woman, it's not a marriage. Or any situation like that, that has to be clearly a biological male and a biological female who marry. And the transgender, it doesn't work in terms of a Catholic wedding. Now, you may be surprised after you get married that the person is transgender in some way or another. Then at that point you realize, well, the marriage is probably not valid in the first place, even though it's a Catholic marriage or whatever marriage it was. Again, this whole thing of transgenderism has become more important in society, and it is something that we have to face that comes up from time to time. Anyway, these are ideas of marriage that I just bring up that you ponder and think about when you want to get married in a Catholic church. One of the things is that most Catholics who want to get married in a Catholic church, 70% of them live together before they're married. Not a great thing. But because of that, they think that they already know each other. And the other 30% sometimes are a little bit confused. That's why we have annulments. That's why the church is going through a particularly difficult time. That's why to get into a good Catholic marriage, we need all the advice we can get to prepare for it well. And that's why it's a sacrament, because we need that sacrament to give us the strength to live the marriage bond. Some ideas to reflect on. Thank you very much.